just here. Yes, inshallah khair. Okay. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, the most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajjil farajahum. Brothers, sisters, assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to this new lesson in the afterlife, where we inshallah will continue where we left off in our series that has to do with the hereafter, the afterlife, taking us from the moment we pass on from this world to the next, and inshallah until for all eternity in heaven, inshallah. So the lesson for today is supposed to be to present the proof for the afterlife. And the manner in which this is going to be done is that we are going to be presenting rational arguments for the necessity of the afterlife today. And inshallah, the second part or the latter part of this discussion, which has to do more with the scriptural Quranic proofs for all of this, is going to be addressed in the next lesson, inshallah. So the lesson, the manner in which it is structured, there's a quick overview. There's a quick introduction where the author basically reminds us of the importance of this topic before telling us that there are two rational arguments that are going to be presented in this lesson, and that the rest of the arguments are going to be relying on the Holy Quran, and those are going to be addressed in the next lessons. The two arguments that are presented, in fact, inshallah, as we will see, the author relies on the two classic arguments for the afterlife. That said, it's, I think, good to know that the manner in which he presents them, he kind of lumps together variants of these, and so it's more than just two arguments that are presented. And in addition to what is presented in the lesson, I decided to complement the arguments presented there with a lot more that inshallah you can find useful and relevant to this topic. I do think it's an important topic. A lot of what is addressed here can be considered just different versions or variants, but you will see that these nuances can make a difference in the manner in which an argument is presented or an argument is understood, and is it convincing or not. So I leave that all with you, but inshallah you'll find it useful and relevant to the topic. So in terms of introduction to today's lesson, when we began this series, the first lesson spent enough time trying to establish the importance of understanding our position with regards to the afterlife. So we said from the beginning that, for a human being to be able to live fully as a human being, they need to have clarity with regards to their worldview. And it's impossible to have a complete worldview related to the manner in which we're supposed to live without answering some very important questions, including where do we come from, which is discussed in Tawheed, and what are we supposed to be doing here? How is this life supposed to work for us, which is covered in Nubuwah and prophethood? And then finally, what happens once we die? Where are we going? And this is what's covered in this third lesson. So from a rational perspective, I think we established this, and we said that this is what's going to give meaning and give direction and orientation to everything that we do in this world. Depending on how you answer the questions related to the afterlife, what happens to us once we die? Is there an afterlife or not? Is it eternity or not? Is there reward and punishment or not? Then you're not supposed to be living your life in the same manner. It's going to have a direct impact on the manner in which you're going to make your choices in this life. Your decisions for every act should have a component in there related to how does this fit into my grand plan with regards to the afterlife. I think at a rational level, we explained all of this. And then we also added to it that if you go back to the religious systems that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent to humanity, we see that there is a very clear insistence on the topic of ma'ad. If you go to the verses of the Holy Quran that speak directly about the afterlife, and I think we went through enough of them, you'll see that there is a direct correlation between belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in God, and belief in the afterlife. You cannot have one without the other. And if you look at the types of verses that we saw, we also saw that they insist, the Holy Quran is very clear that not believing in everything else and not believing in the afterlife is not sufficient. You do not have a full belief system if there are lacks in your belief about the afterlife. And then, the author had also reminded us of the efforts of the prophets. He said that the prophets most likely spent as much, if not more time and more effort in trying to convince their followers and their people of the afterlife as they did for belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we explained the reasons for that. And the author had reminded us, for instance, that there's probably a third of the verses of the Holy Quran, around 2,000 plus verses of the Holy Quran that talk about the topic of the afterlife in general, which means that it's an extremely important topic. From there, we said that it's impossible to get a clear picture, a good, clear understanding of the afterlife as a topic without having clarity on the issue of the soul. So if I cannot find my truth with regards to the soul, if I don't have my position clear with regards to does the soul exist, what's the relationship between the body and the soul, what type of attributes can we characterize the soul with, and so on and so forth, I'm not going to be able to have clear answers and a clear position with regards to the afterlife. So we kind of took a break from continuing with just talking specifically about the afterlife to spend a little bit of time trying to understand the soul. And so we talked about the immateriality of the soul, how the soul is non-material, and we presented some of the proofs for that. We talked about how the notion of identity in both of its meanings. So on the one side, you have identity as in this is the thing that gives the unity, that allows you to say that something is one unit. For living entities, so specifically for us, that's our relevance right now. For a human being, that which holds the entire human being's experience and presence in different time points in time, despite all the changes that occur to them in this world, what holds all of this together is this notion of a soul. There has to be a soul that brings the human being together, okay? That was on one side. And on the other side, we also said that the truth of who you are in essence is not going to be limited to what you see in this body. In fact, this body becomes secondary. It becomes an instrument that comes and goes, but there's something more in the background, more fundamental. Your essence, who you truly are, and we explained all of this in detail, who you truly are is determined by the soul, not determined by the body. Okay? So when all of this was said and done, the conclusion from all of this should be that it should be clear now that if this body is going to die and disappear and decompose, we still have a soul that can continue to exist afterwards. Now, there are details related to this that inshallah will be addressed in the future, okay? But until then, for the time being, all we need from everything that we've said is that once this body dies, once this body decomposes, there is still you, the real you, which is defined by your soul, that can continue to exist and that it will continue to exist. It's an immaterial entity that is not perturbed by what happens to your body. Okay, and we talked about that, I think, enough. So with this, we presented both a more rational understanding of the soul, and then we went quickly through a few verses of the Holy Quran that also talk about the soul to basically confirm and validate how the Holy Quran presents the soul, what does it say about it, and to basically support what we said and what we presented with our rational arguments. So for now, at this point, we're basically going back to our topic of the afterlife, the topic of what happens after we die, so that today we begin with the necessity of the afterlife. That there is an afterlife is a necessary, it's a necessity, it's a necessary reality. Okay, it's not even optional. And we are going to go through that today. How it's going to be done in terms of methodology is that today, inshallah, we're going to be presenting the rational component of this discussion. And once this is established, and the necessity of the afterlife is established with reason, inshallah, we are going to support all of this with the scriptural or Quranic explanation in the next lesson, inshallah. Maybe a quick remark with regards to reason. And this is something that we've mentioned a few times, but I think it's worth repeating very quickly. I think it's an important point. We have said, and inshallah it's clear, that not everything can be reached with reason alone. Reason can reach the generalities. Reason can reach the proofs that we're going to be presenting today. But a lot of maybe our questioning or things that we want to know more about, a lot of the details and the application of what actually happens in more concrete terms, reason can never get to those details on its own. And this is one of the main reasons why when we presented the topic of prophethood and the necessity for the need for this additional guidance and the need for another source of knowledge to humanity, that was one of the main reasons. We said that reason alone, your rationality, your human rationality with all of its abilities is limited. It doesn't have the tools to be able to reach all of the answers, especially the details. So for instance, the details of what happens after we die, we can establish the general guiding principles, as we will do inshallah today, to establish the necessity. But the application in detail of what is going to happen, reason can never say it's going to be this way or that way. And for those, this is where we can say there is no necessity, no logical or rational necessity for those details. It could have been those details, it could have been other details. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose certain details and we would never know about them unless He would tell us about them. Okay, and so this is something just to keep in mind, that when we say we can present some proofs with reason, obviously there's a difference between rational proofs and scriptural proofs, and there's a place for both of them. Both are required, both are important, but they don't play the exact same role. Okay, so just to keep that in mind. So let us move to the first argument for the necessity of the afterlife, the necessity of an afterlife based on our belief system. If you remember, when we began the lessons that had to do with the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the divine attributes, one of the attributes on which we spent a little bit of time was the attribute of wisdom. And we also talked about irada. We explained that irada can be understood as, divine desire or divine want. And we explained what that means. And we said that there's a link between understanding wisdom and understanding justice and understanding the divine wants. So, the details, if you want to go back to those details, or you're just starting out with us and you're interested in knowing more, I think I would refer you back to those lessons where we talked about divine wisdom specifically, as well as perhaps divine justice. Now, what we need from all of that, and maybe as a quick recap and a reminder, is that when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has certain wants, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala desires something, the points that we want to keep in mind so that we don't fall into any objections is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we say He has a want, it cannot be understood as something outside or external of Himself. Otherwise, we quickly fall into having a type of God that has dependence, that requires an entity outside of himself to exist, no matter what type of desire or want it may be. So the only way to understand this is how we had presented it to kind of simplify, is to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what he wants and what he desires is what we refer to as goodness or as perfection. And this is only found in himself, right? So it's kind of a self-reflective type of want or a desire, if you want to call it that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what he wants is he wants perfection. And this is the notion of kamal, that we see the completion, the absolute completion of something, which is perfection, or having reached the ultimate purpose, for instance. That's another way to understand it, which only exists in himself. And if it exists elsewhere, so in his creatures, it only exists as in a secondary manner. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala desires it in himself, and therefore he will desire it in others in a secondary manner. In any case, so this is just something to keep in mind so that we don't fall into certain objections that are sometimes raised against what is divine wisdom. So let's just put that aside. If it's not relevant to you, keep it aside. What did we say about divine wisdom? What we said about divine wisdom is that, in short, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whatever act we look at, we have to be able to clearly say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions are never without purpose. Every action has a purpose. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were to act, and this is the need for this notion of irada, the purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala using to act, is that purpose something that he benefits from? No, because he's self-sufficient in an absolute way. So it's always something to the benefit of the creature. Okay, so the notion of wisdom, what we need from it, from this divine attribute, when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has wisdom, in short, it means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions are always with purpose. There's always an absolutely or perfectly good reason for the act to happen in a certain way, at a certain time, in a certain way, with certain limitations or not, and so on and so forth. And so when we come to want to take this and apply it to the type of world that we have, what does it mean concretely when we say this? It means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he creates this world, he creates it with the purpose. So we ask, what is this purpose? With the purpose of every entity reaching its full potential, which is what we refer to as the perfection. So the point of the creation of this world as a universe and as entities, so for every individual entity as well as the entire universe taken together, the entire system of existence taken together, is that every entity is able to reach its full potential or reach its perfection. That's the ultimate purpose of the creation of everything that exists. Okay? Now, when we look at the world and we start looking at the type of world that we have, we start noticing right away that we live in a world of limitations. We live in a world where there is conflict. We live in a world where if one entity of that world has something, it means something else is deprived of it. This is the type of world we live in. It's a world of conflict, of rivalry, and limitations. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's a material world. And these are the characteristics of matter. And so, keeping in mind what we said about wisdom, it means that this was the intent. This was done with intent, intentionally created, so that it is a world of conflict and a world of rivalry and a world of limitations. This is a purpose. Despite this purpose, because of, again, divine wisdom, every entity has been created in a system that maximizes perfection. So, despite or in spite of these limitations, yes, there are limitations, still this system has been created in a way to maximize the perfections allowed in it. Okay, so yes, there are limitations and they are intentional because this is the type of world Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to create for a purpose. The purpose is our testing and tribulation in this world. And this is what we need. So we need a system that has limitations. Okay? Still, despite this, everything has been created with a background and a system that provides maximum perfection to everything that exists. Okay, so that's generally speaking what we had said about the notion or the attribute of wisdom and what we need from it now. Okay, now we're going to link it to this notion of the afterlife, this belief or this pillar of the afterlife. If we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's act is always with purpose, so because of wisdom, and we look at the state of the world, and we see that this is a world of conflict, and a world of rivalry, and a world of limitations, then we have to ask the question, is it really possible for every entity, and the one that really matters to us is a human being, is it really possible for every entity to reach its full potential and to reach its perfection, the perfection for which it was created to reach? Is it truly possible for every entity to reach that or not? That's a question. If it is not, then we can say that the act, this divine act of creation of the world, contradicts the divine attribute of wisdom. It contradicts wisdom. Otherwise, if it is possible, then we have to see how is that possible. Okay? So this is the beginning and this is the premise for the argument from wisdom, divine wisdom. Let's look at the human soul. As we said, the human soul is the key to understanding what happens to us and who we are. We can also look at the human body, but I think that's going to be a kind of a very reductive, too simplistic argument. So let's concentrate on the soul. Yes, the human body is made of the human entity, the human being is made up of a body and soul. If we come to look at the human soul, based on what we've said until now, the soul is a type of entity that can exist, that has the ability to exist for all of eternity. It is a type of entity, and we did not go into a lot of details related to this, but by virtue of being an immaterial entity, and this is something that we should grasp with, a minimum of reflection. Any human being should be able to understand this. Because it's an immaterial entity that still has wants and needs, and that still finds pleasure, and that still recognizes its perfection and completion in certain things, but because it's immaterial, non-material, then there is no upper limit to how much it wants of those immaterial pleasures and immaterial perfections. So it's a type of existent, it's a type of being that aspires to eternity, able to exist for all of eternity. And it's a type of entity that has an ability to attain infinite levels of pleasure and infinite levels of perfection. And that's why I said, let's not even compare with what you can achieve with bodily pleasures and bodily perfections. Okay, it does not even compare. So because we have the soul and we've established it, let's put the body aside and talk about what defines a human being truly. And so if we look at the soul, it has these characteristics. Now, if I want to say that my existence as a human being is going to be limited to this world, from the moment I'm born until the moment I die, then the question that we asked in the previous slide is, do I truly have the ability to reach my full potential, to fulfill the needs of this soul, the needs which, as we said, can be infinite for pleasure and for perfection and for living eternally? Can they actually be met in the time that I have, that I exist, and with this body in this world, between the time I'm born and the time I breathe my last breath? And of course the answer is no. If I look at the manner in which I live and what I can actually attain in terms of those perfections, even if you want to include pleasures in there, you're going to see that it's very, very limited. It's limited to most likely what I can accomplish with this body and the limitations of this world on my soul. Okay? And here the question is, either I can reach it somehow in this world, or you have to find me another way of reaching it. Otherwise, we are now in a situation that contradicts divine wisdom. So how does it directly contradict divine wisdom? First, it's a matter of efficiency and inefficiency. If you are truly wise, you're not going to create things for, trivial, for no reason, out of foolishness, out of randomness. There has to be a purpose for what you do. So you are saying that, let's say you created this entity, this human being, and you gave him the faculties that are required for him to live his life, to exist. Well, why would that human being, if he's only going to exist between the time he's born in this world until the time he dies, why would he have been granted the ability to exist forever through his soul? Why would that human being have the ability through his soul to feel infinitely more pleasure or infinitely more perfection, and yet all he can attain, all he can reach in this world is the limitations of this world? Is dictated by the limitations of this world. This means that it's not efficient. If I need, I need to build a building for myself to store things or to live in, and I need 1 floor. And I end up building a building that has 10 floors, and yet there is no way for me to get to the 2nd floor. There's no elevator, there's no staircase, there's no door. It's a building built with 10 floors, but you can only access the 1st floor. Anyone looking at this would say that floors 2 to 10 are against wisdom, contradict wisdom. This is complete inefficiency. You've done something that you completely do not need. Does the human being need the soul or not? If so, where is it going to be used? The incredible potential of the soul is never going to be fulfilled in this world. So where is it going to be fulfilled? That's one point related to this topic of divine wisdom, the divine act, having created a human being with this type of potential through the immaterial soul. That's one. The second point related to this, now let's look at the type of world that we live in. When you look at even those things that, let's say a materialist, someone who lives in this world and says nothing else exists but this world. Even someone who says that, when they look at the world, no one is going to say that there are true pleasures in this world. There are no true pleasures in this world. Everything that we have in this world, even the greatest of its pleasures, the things that you can experience with the most pleasure and that makes you feel the most perfect or complete, whatever it may be, is always going to be limited. It's always going to come at a price. It's always going to have a side effect. This is the type of world that it is. And as we said, when we apply it to a human being specifically, this is with intent. The reason why there are no raw pleasures, pure pleasures in this world is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not create pure pleasures in this world. He created a world where everything depends on something else. And for you to feel a certain pleasure, it means you have to have put in an effort, and you have to have done work, and you have to have struggled. And this takes away from something else. And there might be a side effect to it. And there's a price to pay for everything. And there are regrets, and there are. There's always a limitation. There's always something that comes to kind of, we can say, ruin this pleasure, this perfection that you're aspiring to in this world, no matter how you spin it. Okay, because this is the type of world that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended. And if you want to dig deeper, you'll say this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created to make you realize that what you're truly looking for does not exist in this world. So turn your attention to those things that will give you those that are going to fulfill those needs of yours for perfection and for eternity and for much more pleasure than you can ever have and get in this world, without all the limitations and without all the side effects and without all the regrets and without the price that you have to pay in this world. Okay, so that's on one side of this. And the other side is it's simply impossible in a world of matter, in a material world, in a world of limitations, to create those types of pleasures and those types of perfections. Okay, So the more we think about the type of world that we exist in, and the more we see that these notions of pleasure are not really pure here. And that's why, I put it in the in quotation marks. If you look at the slide, you'll see, think about this world and its pleasures. Are they truly pleasures? The author here in the book, he tells us those who have really thought about the pleasures of this world, they tell us that for the amount of effort required to reach those pleasures, you see that those pleasures are almost not worth it. There's so much work that has to go and so much sacrifice that has to be put into going towards perfections and going towards the pleasures of this world. So he gives us an example. He says in this world, it's like the more you think about it and the more you see how things work, if you're limiting your existence to this world, it's like someone who is in a car and they happen to need gas. They put gas in the car so that they can drive around. So you see them get into the car and they start driving, and they drive to the next gas station so that they can fill the car, they can fill the tank with as much gas as possible, and then they drive to the next gas station where they get to fill the car again, and then they drive to the next gas station as the gas runs out every time. And they continue like this forever until either the car stops functioning because it falls to pieces, or they get into an accident and everything stops. And he says, if you think about this world, you'll see that it's something like this. If your life is simply limited by what happens between the time you are born into this world and the time you die in this world, that's basically what it is. You are constantly in a cycle where you are feeding yourself enough to be able to do whatever you need to do or you want to do or aspire to do until you reach exhaustion. It could be mental, it could be psychological, it could be physical. You do what you need to do to nourish yourself, to recharge yourself, do it again. You run out of energy, you rest, and then do it again, and then until everything ends. And this is why the author says that this type of life is absolutely meaningless. If this is your understanding of your existence, if this is what you think you've been created for, then you basically live an absurd life. This is absurdity. This is meaninglessness. Right? And so this is where he says you have people who end up, the more they think about this, the more they reach the conclusion that, suicide is the answer out of all of this. So this is what he mentions in the book. So here I thought I would add a little bit more because I think it's an important topic and something very relevant to, I think a lot of us, but a lot of what's happening in the world, to link it a little bit and give it a little bit of a, let's call it a philosophical background and or more rational, underpinning, so that you know where to go and look and understand a little bit of what happens in the kind of more rational realm related to all of this and the history of thought and all of that. Humanity has struggled with these questions forever. This is what defines you as a human being. This is a universal need in you, a desire and a need in you to have meaning to your life. And this is what, depending on how you answer this question, you're going into a completely different path. And this was, or becomes, one of the ways to understand why entire philosophical schools and lifestyles are created. And so some people are going to say it's all meaningless, or all that exists is what we have in this world, and this is what you have with, hedonism. So this is people who basically say the school of thought or the idea, and this comes to us from the ancient Greeks, who basically say that, the purpose, the ultimate purpose for the human being is to basically live with maximum pleasure and with minimum pain. So your point, your existence, its entire purpose is to reduce or eliminate all pain and to live in as much pleasure as possible. And of course, this was taken, and there are all sorts of variants nowadays. They've added ethics to it so that you don't harm anyone else, and so on and so forth. But the problem is those who have really thought about this, so the big philosophers and thinkers who have spent time thinking about these things, they've rejected the answer of hedonism. They say that you do not give us a real purpose with this. So there's still the absurdity the absurdity of, kind of like the person driving in the car. And it still leads to meaninglessness. So why? The ultimate why, the so why? So what that I get this pleasure? Then what? And so the answer here of hedonism is limited. It stops there. And the others, those other thinkers, they have continued, but they reach the conclusion that it's therefore all meaningless and all absurd. And if you go all the way to, if you go back in philosophy, all the way to the ancient Greeks, in ancient mythology, there is this character, Sisyphus, who was, long story short, without going into the entire mythology of it, this is someone that the gods, at the end, the gods wanted to punish him, because every time that, something would happen and he's supposed to go to the world of the dead, he would find a way to escape. So at the end, he was punished. And the punishment, long story short, the punishment is that he had to carry a boulder, a very big rock, up a mountain. And every time he would roll it all the way up to the top of the mountain, before he would get there, the boulder would fall back and roll back down. And then he has to go back and carry it again and try to do it again. And this became his punishment until eternity, for all of eternity. This is what he has to keep repeating. And this became kind of the seeds for this, philosophy of existentialism and, nihilism and absurdism. So these are the big schools of thought that have mentioned this and have, built around this and applied it to our day-to-day existence, that you feel that you just have to keep repeating a trivial task that does not really have any meaning, and that at the end you're not going to be able to accomplish anything. It's just a repetition built on a repetition built on a repetition ad infinitum. It just continues like this. So there's an absurdity to your life, and this need for meaning became the, like there are thinkers basically like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. They started working on this notion of what is the meaning of our existence. And if you combine this with the social conditions and the religious conditions happening in their time, you'll see that they were reacting very strongly to very specific things, okay? And I don't have time to go into all of this, but there was a very heavy critique of religion happening at that time, Christianity in Europe specifically. And then not that long after, you had World War I. So with all of this together, happening together, you have thinkers who are starting to try to see, so what is the meaning of life? And the conclusion they're reaching from all of this is that there is no meaning. They cannot find any meaning. The more they dig, the more they're stuck with, there cannot be any more meaning to this. So here's where some thinkers started to go in different paths. Some thinkers started saying, well, we as human beings have a free will. And regardless of what is happening in the world and the state and the condition of the world and the limitations and absurdity of the world, regardless of all of this, because you have a free will, you still get to choose how you want to experience your life and where you can create your own meaning and you can create your own value and you can decide for yourself that it is absurd or not. And you can still live your life happily. And this became the more existentialist school, okay? On the other side, there are those thinkers that rejected this. And they said, no, you're just fooling yourself. So some of them, they tried to find this meaning through religion. So for instance, Kierkegaard, he was one of those who said, there is complete absurdity, complete meaninglessness, and all the critiques of religion are true. But yet what is required of you is to have a leap of faith, to still believe. And this still believe is what is going to remove the absurdity of the system out of the equation. And then others, you have Camus, Albert Camus, and he comes and completely goes all the way out with the absurdism. And he basically attacks, he says, there are two things that people are trying to use to give meaning to their existence. So it's either religion, so this is why he criticizes Soren Kierkegaard. And so he says this is just like, fluff that you create, superficial meanings that you create for yourself, but they're not really there. And so it's absurd. And or, so either religion or nationalism. So you're trying to create a national identity, and this is linked, of course, to the wars and people going to sacrifice themselves for nations and so on and so forth. And he basically criticizes all of that and says, at the end, you're still getting a completely absurd worldview. And so at the end, he tries to find a way for you to still try to find meaning, create meaning where there is none, create meaning so that you can still live a good life and a charitable life and so on and so forth. But if you see these, you know, the potential outcomes that they even have in their books and in their works, they're talking potentially about committing suicide, but then they say, we're not going to commit suicide because committing suicide is basically only adding more absurdity to the absurdity. So we're not going to commit suicide. That said, if you go back in the history of thought, you will see that there are many, many philosophers who actually ended up, and thinkers and people who were struggling specifically with these questions, who did end up committing suicide and ending their lives specifically for these reasons, because of this meaninglessness of their lives. Okay? So here are the options. If you are into this spiral, downward spiral of there is no meaning because you're stuck in a world where you are born at some point and then this body dies and there's nothing beyond that. If you're stuck in this, so either you're committing suicide as one outcome. The other outcome is you go towards religion, as you know, as I said, somewhere like Albert Camus, he considers that, he calls that philosophical suicide. What Soren Kierkegaard has had proposed, that you do this leap of faith. You don't really believe in it, but you have to hope, and or you just accept. So you have to find a way to create an acceptance for yourself that you are going to live with this absurdity. And this is what Soren Kierkegaard had referred to, which is kind of what Albert Camus and others have done. And Kierkegaard refers to that as a demoniac madness. He's basically saying it's like you're mad and you know, the devil has come into you and made you try to accept this absurd condition that you're living in. So basically, long story short, there is no outcome. You're stuck. You're stuck in a world that has no meaning. You're stuck in an existence that has no meaning. And you have to artificially create something where you know there is none. There is no meaning. And this is where I would say, you know, compare this type of worldview to one where you say you are not created for this world. There is more than what's happening here. Like the comparison should be, you know, striking. The more you delve deeper into this topic and you see where it can lead you, depending on the path that you take and the positions that you take with regards to, is there wisdom? Is there a creator? Is there meaning behind this world? Is there a purpose for you to exist here in a certain way or not? What about the difficulties that you go through in this world? Do they have meaning or not? See where it could lead you, depending on whether you say your existence is limited to this world versus it's absolutely not about this world. This world is a transitory phase towards something that is the purpose and not what's going on here. In any case. So with all of this said, keeping all of that in mind, the author adds here something that he doesn't present as a new argument, but what I'm saying here is this is a new argument that the author presents. So the first argument had to do with the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of this world, has wisdom. So everything he does with a purpose, including the fact that he gave you an ability to reach much higher perfections and eternity. And therefore that cannot be without purpose, without reason. That was basically the gist of argument one. The second argument, which is still under the big heading of divine wisdom, is that if you look specifically in the human being, one of the instincts that you find in us is that we aspire to, we are instinctively created with a drive towards eternity. Everything we do can be explained with how we react to our aspiration for eternity. That's the reason why we do everything we do. And the big thinkers have, you know, spent a lot of time thinking about this, how human beings have confronted the issue of death, their own imminent death. It will happen. It's inevitable. The more you think about that, then the more you see that it will hit you. So what are you going to do about it? And a lot of, psychoanalysis and a lot of the drives behind everything we do as human beings can be explained with this desire to remain in existence forever. So the question is, why does this instinct exist in us? Why do we feel that we want to stay in being, present forever? Where does this come from? And here, the argument is built. Again, this is not in the book, but I thought, I'll give it to you so that you can look it up, and if you're interested, and elaborate a little bit more on this. This is usually referred to as the argument from desire. So this is the type of argument, or how these arguments are built. There's a lot of versions or variants to them. Is that basically you find something in you that you desire. Human beings have desires. They aspire to certain things. They recognize certain things. So if you find this type of desire in you, the question is, why was it put there? And the classic version of these arguments is they are all built on a premise that comes from Aristotelian and Greek philosophy, which is nature does not do anything in vain. Okay? So of course here nature, and we don't want to get into the theology of it and all of that. I'm just presenting the classic version of the argument. So they say nature does nothing in vain. So if you found something in nature, for instance, in yourself, you find this desire, this aspiration towards eternity, then this is not in vain. There's a reason for you to desire eternity. It means that there is a way for you to get it, to reach it, to access it. Okay, so this is kind of the gist of the argument. There are many, many variants to it. So here the author presents a simple version of this argument. Basically, as a human being, every human being has an aspiration, a desire to remain in existence forever. The question is why? And is this a desire that can be fulfilled in this world? And the short answer is no. So the only way that this desire can be fulfilled is with an eternity after this world. You do exist for eternity, and this is explained by the afterlife. A world that happens after this world that allows your eternal existence. Now, one thing that I wanted to add here, because if you get into the argument from desire and its critique, the criticism that it has sparked over the centuries, there is a weakness depending on how you present it. The key here, so let's say if we talk about divine wisdom, for instance, the key is not that if you find something in you, a desire in you, it's not that this desire has to be fulfilled. So it's not every human being who can fulfill to 100% of their potential. That does not, we don't need to go that far for the argument to work. All you need is to say that you have an ability to. You have to have the potential to reach that conclusion, to reach that outcome. If the opportunity is there, then it's up to you to reach it or not. If there is no opportunity, then we have a contradiction of wisdom. You have put a faculty in me, you have put a desire in me, a need in me that I can never fulfill. Okay, that goes against wisdom. You have put a desire in me that I can fulfill potentially, that meets wisdom. That I have to, that I will fulfill, well, that goes against freedom of choice. So this is where the key is. It's not because everybody does not reach, or some people do not reach, that we say the wisdom argument doesn't work. No, the wisdom argument still works with the argument from desire. So you have a desire to remain in existence forever. And in this case, it can be explained with an afterlife. In other variants of the argument from desire for other things, it has to be explained with other things, just to keep something to keep in mind. So in summary, what we have said right now is divine wisdom, when combined with the manner in which human beings have been created and the desires that we find in their souls, the ability and potential of the soul to reach much higher perfections and pleasures than what we find in this world, means that there needs to be another space, another forum, another venue where that soul is going to be able to reach those pleasures, to reach those perfections, even if it's not happening in this world. And therefore, we get the necessity of an afterlife through divine wisdom. That's one version. And we can combine it with, or we can look at it separately with the other argument, which is if a human being looks internally, they will find in themselves a universal desire that has existed forever in humanity. And many thinkers have in fact said that, this is what has triggered religions to come into existence, is this desire for an eternal existence. And this needs to be explained somehow, especially if you believe in a God and a wise God. And because we have established that there is a God and he is wise, therefore, if you find an attribute in yourself, a trait, a desire, a need in yourself, it needs to be explained with what is the purpose? Why was it put there in you if it cannot be fulfilled, if it cannot be attained? That would go against wisdom. And therefore, out of necessity, we therefore need an afterlife where those needs are going to be met. Okay, that's in short. The corollary to this, we have to be able to add something to this, which is, therefore, based on everything we've said until now, therefore, that other world must be a very different type of world than what we have here. It's a different world because it cannot be a world where we have the same limitations of this world. It cannot be a world where we have the same types of struggles, same types of difficulties that will impede, that will act as a barrier, that will basically put you back in the same situation you're in with a soul that is unable to reach its full potential. All of that needs to be removed from that afterworld, afterlife, so that we answer, it becomes the answer to all the objections and all the issues that we have against this world, in that it does not allow the full potential to be actualized of the human soul. Okay? Now, that was all for the first argument. I don't have a lot of time for the second. I'll try to cover it quickly. The argument from justice, I think it's a very instinctive argument. Generally speaking, when we look at this world, this is a second argument for the necessity of the afterlife. When we look at this world, we see that human beings have been granted a free will. They have the ability when they act to choose to do good or to do bad. And the point of all of this, as we have said, this freedom of choice, is that it is actually a test. From the moment you can make deliberate choices until the moment you breathe your last breath, everything that happens in this world is a test, and you have a choice to make. And the choice is going to be, I do good or I don't do good. I do bad. I do good or I do evil. So some choose to do some good and some bad. Some choose to do a lot of good or only do good. And some choose to do a lot of bad or, only bad if that exists. Okay. With that, keeping that in mind, now I want to present 5 variants of this argument. The author presents one of these. I'm going to present 5 variants to this argument. The first one. So keeping in mind, you have freedom of choice, you have people who do good and people who do bad, and people who do a lot of good and a lot of bad. Variant 1 or point 1 for this argument is that when we look at good people in this world, a lot of them, there are some incredibly good people in this world. Okay, let's take extreme cases so that we go faster and the argument becomes clearer. Let's take someone who only does good, someone who worships God all the time, someone who is extremely sincere in spending their entire life in charitable acts, helping others, and in sincere spiritual purification, always towards God. Take someone like that, and the manner in which this world deals with them. Do we feel that the world is rewarding them for all this goodness? And let's take someone on the other side. When we look at someone who has, let's say, done extreme evil throughout their lives, every opportunity they had until they died in this world, do we feel that the world punishes them? Or do we not see in a lot of cases that unfortunately it looks like it's even the opposite? People who are really good, people who sacrifice, people who spend their time and their money and their everything they have for the good? Do they have the recognition? Do they have the treatment and the dealing of the world that is commensurate, that is appropriate, that is equal to what all the good that they are putting in this world? Of course not. And that's how you see that in this world, a lot of extremely good people are in extremely bad situations. And a lot of them end up dying, end up being killed, end up being poor, end up being oppressed. And look at the histories of, greats, and look at the histories of reformers, and look at the histories of prophets, and you have multiple, countless examples of extremely good people and the manner in which this world deals with them. And you have the opposite. People who are narcissistic, egotistic, people who are extremely selfish, oppressive, tyrants. They can live a very, very good life, full of luxuries and comforts and ease, and even sometimes recognition and a reputation that will go on for centuries as though that they are good, and people, honor them and respect them and remember them, and statues and so on and so forth. This is the type of world that we live in. Okay, so first argument is, when you look at the state of the world, you see that not only is sometimes good punished and bad, not only is good not always rewarded and bad not always punished, but in fact, good is sometimes punished and bad is sometimes rewarded. In fact, it happens often. That's one variant. A second variant, or a second point to add to this, is that if you look, and this is a recognition that human beings have, if you look at an act, just looking at the act in itself, or anything in itself, an act, you should be able to recognize, unless you're one of the Asha'ira, and that's a completely different discussion, you should be able to recognize rationally that there is an intrinsic good in that act, or there's an intrinsic bad in that act. You're able to recognize that there is good. Most human beings, if not all, when they look at an act, they will see this is an injustice. This is a good act. This is a bad act. This is a charitable act. This recognition means that you're also, as a human being, universally able to recognize that when you see good, you say it should be rewarded with good. And when you see bad, you say it should be rewarded with bad. Evil should be rewarded with evil, or punishment, or something that matches what this did. Okay? That's 2. 3, if you want to look at all of humanity, so forget the argument that there is an intrinsic good and an intrinsic bad in itself. So when you say, for instance, you see someone doing good, you say, of course, they need to be rewarded with good. You see someone doing bad, they need to be rewarded with something bad. Let's put that aside. If all human beings did exactly the same thing to an equal degree, then we might say there is no need to reward or punish because everybody is acting the exact same way. But when we look at the manner in which human beings actually live, we see that there's a huge variance. In other words, there's a huge difference between how one person is acting and how another is acting. So this difference becomes an additional argument. You cannot treat two people doing different things in the same way. So regardless of the intrinsic good or bad, there's also the difference, the distinction that you want to give to this person or that person. There's something fundamentally different that is being done by these two. You cannot reward both and you cannot punish both because they did something different. So this difference needs to be recognized, and it's not recognized in this world. Another argument, or another variant of this argument, is that if you look at certain acts and certain people, to simplify it, let's say acts. There are acts that are so evil that there is not enough in this world to be able to punish them. And there are acts that are so good in this world that nothing in this world can be used to reward them. Let's say someone who gives all of their money and all of their time and all of their energy to very good causes all of their life, the entire life. What's the way to reward someone like that? How do you reward them? How do you reward someone who sacrificed their life for someone else? Let's say someone who saved someone else's life and died in the process. Let's say you are someone like, the companions of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. How do you reward someone who has left this world and who has left this world in this manner, sacrificing everything all the way to their self, to their life, for a greater good cause? How do you reward them in this world? How do you punish someone who has, let's say, caused the death of, let's say, 1,000 people or 10,000 people or 5 million people? How do you punish someone like that? What can you do? You torture them, you kill them. The most that you can do is to take away their life. That's one life. How do you punish what they have done in this world? Again, this world does not allow for those cases of too much good and too much evil. There's no way for you to do anything with those in this world. And finally, some have said that another argument from the theme of justice and divine justice, always a variant to this, is that you find it in yourself with a little bit of introspection. If you look at yourself and you study yourself and understand yourself as a human being, if you're really in touch with yourself as a human being, you see that there is a constant tribunal taking place within you, within yourself, and that is the role that your conscience plays. You're constantly in a situation of being judged by yourself, by your conscience, and being told this was good, you're rewarded for it. This recognition, this good feeling that you have, you're proud, or you're at peace, or you feel fulfilled, or because you have done good. And the opposite, the regret that you have, the blame that you have, the self-discipline that you have internally, the reprimand, the self-reprimand that you have, if you have done something that you recognize as bad or as evil. So this is a smaller version of what is happening in the afterlife, on the day of judgment. They say this, if you find it in yourself, it means it's there at a grander scale, and that it's awaiting you, and it's awaiting us collectively and individually. So the conclusion from all of this is that when we look at the state of the world, when we look at acts of human beings who have a free will, who get to choose, because this is a type of world that we live in, whether to act in good or with evilness, depending on their choice, we see that we live in a world where those choices are not rewarded and not recognized in this world appropriately. In fact, it's impossible to. So there is therefore a necessity, for all the reasons that we mentioned, for that good to be compensated with an appropriate good, commensurate with it, and for the evil to be compensated with something that is appropriate to it. And inshallah, we'll get into the details. Of course, where does forgiveness fall into all of this, and where does shafa'ah fall into all of this, and where does ihbat al-a'mal fall into all of this? We'll talk about those details. But this is the rational argument for all of this, that good needs to be compensated with good, and bad needs to be compensated with punishment. There's one more argument outside of the justice, the argument from justice and the argument from wisdom. And this is kind of like a semi-rational argument that is sometimes mentioned in some books. So I thought I'd add it here in some theology classics. And that is the argument that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised that there is an afterlife. And that in itself becomes the argument. And the argument is basically made up of two premises. Premise one is that when a promise is made, it ought to be respected. It ought to be kept. And the one who never breaks his promise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah Almighty, has promised that there is an afterlife. Conclusion, there is an afterlife. But of course, the part that we say Allah has promised means that you're taking that from revelation. And so that's why I said this is more of a semi-rational argument, not a full argument. And I don't think that it requires a lot more explanation. So I thought I would just add it here so that you feel that you had kind of a fulsome, complete presentation of the main, 2 to 3 rational arguments with all of their variants for establishing the necessity of the afterlife. And inshallah, when we will continue with this, we'll see how this is presented from a Quranic perspective, from the scriptural and revelatory angle. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أحسنتم سيد. جزاك الله خير. I'm not sure if there's any questions. Please send it on the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. I can see that we have someone. Sayid Taha, you can unmute yourself now.
Ahsantum Sayid, Jazakallah khair for the lecture, mashallah, very beneficial. Just wanted to go back to something that you said in the part where you were talking about the three positions, from the nihilistic, from the Kierkegaardian position, and just the acceptance position of man's search for meaning. And in that worldview, right, especially if I'm looking at more on the acceptance side, the acceptance of things just the way they are, regardless of if God exists or not. Is that sort of position even tenable, right? I mean, so basically, can man even find meaning without God in any shape or form?
Is that the question?
Yes, in the sense that, is it even possible to find meaning besides finding meaning in God in any shape or form?
Yeah, so I think it's, the question seems very simple, but it's actually, it's a deep question. The short answer, I think it's very easy for someone who wants to criticize my answer now to say that, I'm biased or, but I think the short answer personally to me, it's that, no, it's not. I'm someone that, if I want to be completely sincere and objective, and I want to say, what happens if I remove the notion of God and I remove the notion of an afterlife from my life? Can I still have meaning? One, can I still go, what's my way of dealing with difficulties and struggles? You're, let's say, married to someone, and after years of marriage, that person gets very sick, and it's just the two of you, you don't know anyone else. Your, let's say, financial condition is difficult, and so on and so forth. So in those cases where no one would know, let's say there are no social pressures on you, no one would know, you live in a foreign land, no one is aware of this, but this person is sick, and it's just too much struggle for you to remain together, too much of a hardship and a headache. What keeps you together? So unless you have something more, let's say you're, it's a situation where it becomes very, I don't want to go into the details of it, but these are the conditions, these are the situations where I think the rubber hits the road. It's not day-to-day easy living, and it's where you are really put to the test in terms of your ethics. It's really where you're put to the test in terms of you need meaning. This is where you're going to get your energy and allow something that gives you the drive and the ability to face the difficulties and not crumble in front of them, and not basically run away towards whatever happens to be the easier way out. This is what's going to determine who you are, and who you are needs to come from somewhere. And maybe for others, they're able to find meaning, but I think in a lot of cases, if you dig deeper, you see they're not really doing it for themselves. It's under social pressure, it's under something. And this is where I think those philosophers say that this is absurd. And the only reason why they're saying you have to go towards acceptance, it's not because it's a rational choice. It's because they say this is the only option if you've rejected suicide. The only option left is that you have to accept. I don't care how you do it. Basically, that's what they're saying. Get on with the program. It's an absurd world, and there's no meaning to anything. And yet in all of this, you're still supposed to, find a way for yourself to live. And now, in most recent times, in a few past a couple of decades, the argument for ethics has been added in there too. So now they're adding the component that it is possible to live an ethical life while you do not believe in anything outside of this materialistic world, or materialist world, or worldview. So, I struggle with that one a lot too. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and give the full scope and full power to their argument, but I don't think their argument holds. they're just kind of, they know that there's an issue with the fact that you say a human being says there is no meaning and I'm struggling with not finding any meaning. You've removed all the meaning from my existence. Everything that used to have meaning no longer has, postmodern world and postmodern world. So where am I supposed to find meaning? So it's either constantly living in a state of, dizziness, and I'm going to replace it with, I don't care, don't tell me about it. So I occupy myself with distractions, one, or I'm going to pretend. We all know that doesn't work, but out of necessity, I have to pretend. That's my interpretation today. If I want to be completely realistic about this. But I know that this is not necessarily how it's presented. So you'd have to go to the big atheists who talk about this all the time, and the ones who are, vocal and trying to establish some sort of ethical, moral philosophy, ethics or moral philosophy to, an atheistic worldview that, the reality is it's meaningless or absurd, recognizes the absurdity of the world.
Ahsantum, Sayid. We want to thank you. We reached our limit, inshallah. If anyone still have any question related to this lecture, please keep it to the next week. Inshallah, we can answer it, or you can email it to us, and then we can forward the Sayid. Jazakallah, Sayid. Do you want to say anything before we?
No, thank you very much. And inshallah, I'm really looking forward. I know there's, I think, a couple more people who had raised hands or maybe wanted to say or ask something. Please send it. And we can either start or end with it next time that we meet, inshallah. It helps to receive them. Maybe I can less improvise and more prepared if I have time. But inshallah, I'm looking forward to all of your questions, concerns, remarks. I'm always interested in those. Inshallah, you found it beneficial, and see you all next time, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Sayid.